The galaxy was not silent, but it felt so to those who drifted through its dying light. Stars burned themselves into ash, collapsing under their own exhaustion, their brilliance reduced to the faintest whispers across the void. The Imperium clung to those embers as if they were torches in a storm. Yet even the most faithful knew the truth. Empires are built to fall, and legacies are carved only to be broken. In the spaces between those faltering lights, memory bled into prophecy, and whispers grew into storms. This was the hour where shadows reached further than suns, where ambition outlasted faith, and where a single name would be spoken not with reverence, but with fear. Abaddon, you who listen now, you who follow these echoes across the ages, this story belongs to you as much as it does to him. For we do not tell these things only to remember, but to remind. We love you for being here, drawn into the silence of this tale. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let us begin. The siege of terror was long past, and yet its dust lingered in every chamber, every ship, every whispered oath of vengeance. Abaddon had walked among those ruins, a shadow at Horus's side, his blade wet with the blood of brothers who once swore eternal loyalty. He had believed in the War Master more than in the Emperor, believed in the vision of a galaxy not bound by chains of false divinity. And yet, when the end came, it had not been the Emperor's death that filled the void of his chest, but Horus's fall, his father, his master, his hope, struck down by a hand that claimed to be divine. That wound never closed. It festered, twisting in silence. Now he stood upon the bridge of a ship that drifted near the edge of the Eye of Terror, the swirling wound in reality that bled madness into the stars. The void around him hummed with the faint cries of things that had never been alive, and still he felt the weight of eyes that were not eyes, of voices that spoke without sound. The bridge was lined with warriors who had once been lunar wolves, their armor corroded and darkened by centuries of exile. They watched him, not as they once watched Horus, but with something colder, a hunger for leadership, and a readiness to tear it from him should he falter. Abaddon's hand rested on the talon of Horus, the gauntlet that had once torn through Primarchs and made the Emperor bleed. Its weight was unbearable and yet essential. He hated it as much as he cherished it, for it was both a relic of loyalty and a shackle of memory. He had taken it not to honor Horus, but to remind himself that he was no longer a son. He was the last witness, and perhaps the last heir. In the silence of the bridge, he thought of the past. He remembered the faces of his brothers, their voices before bitterness consumed them. Tarik Torgadon, laughing before war. Garviel Loken, questioning yet loyal. Horus himself, radiant with charisma, a son around whom they all orbited, all gone, reduced to echoes. Abaddon knew that memory was not enough. A galaxy could not be built on ghosts. The Imperium endured, bloated and wounded, but still breathing, still preaching its false god. To destroy it, he would need more than grief. He would need eternity. He closed his eyes, and the warp pressed against him. It was not the first time. Since Horus's death, he had heard it, whispers promising him dominion, visions of him crowned in shadow, fleets at his command, and gods kneeling in acknowledgement. He despised the gods, for he saw in them the chains that had bound Horus, the lies that had consumed the dream of freedom. And yet he knew power was no longer mortal. If he was to forge a new path, it would not be as a man. It would not be as a son. It would be as something else. The ship shuddered as it entered the eye's lightless storm. Colors bled into one another beyond the viewing bay. shapes of things that should not exist swimming through infinity. The warriors muttered prayers, not to the Emperor, never again, but to powers they could neither name nor comprehend. Abaddon remained silent. He had no prayers left, only resolve. A figure approached him, a sorcerer, draped in robes stitched with runes that shimmered faintly in the shifting glow. His voice was low, sibilant, a knife sliding into the dark. "First, Captain, the gods await your answer. They offer you what Horus refused: immortality, victory, dominion." Abaddon did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed on the storm. "And what price?" "Only loyalty," the sorcerer whispered. "Only the oath that Horus broke when doubt entered his heart. You are stronger than he was. You will not falter. You will be more than a shadow. You will be eternal." The words should have filled him with fire. Instead, they carved deeper into his silence. He thought again of Horus at the end, broken, manipulated, crushed beneath powers he thought he commanded. Abaddon clenched the talon until the claws scraped against the metal railing, leaving scars in its frame. He had no intention of being another puppet. "I will not kneel," he said softly. "Not as Horus did. If they want my hand, they will take it by force." The sorcerer bowed, though his expression hid disappointment. "Then they will come to you in dreams, and in time, perhaps, you will understand." Alone again, Abaddon looked into the storm. For a moment, he thought he saw Horus, not the war master, but the father he had once loved, his face unscarred, his voice calling to him as it had when they first swore to bring light to the galaxy. The vision tore at him, a knife of longing and rage. He reached out, only for the storm to scatter into laughter. The gods had already begun their games. When he turned back to his warriors, he saw them watching him. They did not question, did not speak, but he saw their doubt. They needed more than a captain who carried the relics of the past. They needed a leader who could shape tomorrow, even if tomorrow was drenched in blood. And in that moment, Abaddon understood the truth. To build his empire, he would have to sacrifice not only loyalty, but memory. Horus was dead. The Imperium was wounded. The galaxy itself was broken. If he was to rise, he would do so alone, with no father to follow and no god to serve. His path would be carved not in faith, but in fire. And though he did not yet name it, though he did not yet see its shape, the first crusade was already stirring in his mind. A war not for vengeance alone, but for dominion eternal. The stars outside flickered, and one by one, they died into the void. Abaddon watched them fade, and in their silence, he heard his destiny take root. The past did not rest. It haunted him like a wound that would never close, gnawing at the edges of his every thought. Abaddon remembered the golden days when he marched as first captain of the Lunar Wolves, his armor gleaming with the pride of loyalty, his heart bound to Horus as tightly as any son to a father. The galaxy had once seemed endless, ripe for conquest, filled with stars waiting to be claimed for humanity's glory. He remembered standing shoulder to shoulder with brothers who laughed before battle, who spoke of duty as if it were a sacred oath, who trusted the Emperor's dream of unity. But those memories came now like ghosts, faded and distant, as though they belonged to someone else. He was not the man who bore them, not anymore, and perhaps he never would be again. When Horus fell, something greater than blood had died. Abaddon had seen it happen. The brilliance of his master extinguished in a blaze of betrayal, not only by the Emperor, but by the very gods who had whispered their promises of power. Horus had been their weapon, their puppet, their brightest star corrupted into darkness until he was no longer the man Abaddon had loved. but a hollow shell wielded by hands unseen. That knowledge cut deeper than any blade. Abaddon despised the Emperor for striking him down, but he despised the gods more for hollowing him out. He had been left with nothing but ashes, a galaxy divided, a legion shattered, and his own soul suspended between loyalty and hatred. Yet the warriors still looked to him. On every ship that drifted through the storm-racked void, among every warband that clung to memory of the past, his name was whispered with weight. Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain, bearer of the Talon, the one who had never bent, even when hope was crushed. They came to him not out of devotion alone, but because they feared the alternative: endless division, endless decay, traitor turning upon traitor until all was lost to the warp. He felt their eyes, heavy and searching, waiting for him to become something more than a man drowning in the memory of Horus. One night, if such a word had meaning in the warp, where suns and shadows blended, he walked the silent halls of the ship alone. The corridors echoed with the whispers of its machine spirit, broken and half-mad, chanting fragments of prayers it had learned long ago. His footsteps carried him to the chamber where relics were kept, not for worship, but for remembrance. Broken banners of the lunar wolves, scarred helms of warriors long dead, fragments of weapons that had once struck terror into the stars. He ran a gauntleted hand across the frayed cloth, feeling the weight of what was lost. A voice came behind him, softer than the roar of war, but filled with urgency. It was Varus, a captain who had fought at his side on Terra, scarred and grim. "Ezekiel," he said, using the name with the familiarity of a brother. "The men are restless. They do not understand where we go, or why we drift here at the edge of the storm. They need you to speak. They need you to lead." Abaddon did not turn. His eyes remained fixed on the ruined banners, his voice low. "And what would I tell them? That I will give them victory where Horus failed. That I will build them an empire out of the bones of a broken dream. They would hear lies in those words, and they would know it." Varus stepped closer, his face etched with defiance. "They do not need lies. They need certainty. You are all that remains of what we once were. They followed Horus because he gave them vision. Give them one now, even if it must be carved from fire and shadow. Without it, they will turn on each other, and we will die as carrion in the dark." The words pierced him, for he knew they were true. The legions were broken things, fragments scattered across the eye, feeding on themselves like beasts. If he did not seize them, another would. A sorcerer, a demon-bound tyrant, a pretender who would wear Horus's name like a mask. Abaddon's blood seethed at the thought. None had the right to claim that legacy, none but him. Yet to claim it was to walk a path deeper into damnation, one he had sworn to resist. He turned at last, his eyes burning with a fire that frightened even Varus. "I will not be Horus," he said. "I will not be another puppet dancing on chains for the gods to laugh at. If they follow me, it will be because I am more than he was, because I am free." Varus lowered his gaze, but a faint smile touched his lips. "Then speak it. Make them believe. Give them the reason they crave." That night, Abaddon stood before his warriors. They gathered in the great hall, their armor scarred, their banners tattered, their eyes reflecting the storm outside. They were killers, traitors, exiles, yet within each of them flickered the memory of what they had once been. Lunar wolves, sons of Horus, warriors of the Great Crusade. Abaddon felt their hunger, their desperation. He raised the talon, its claws glinting in the warp's shifting glow, and let his voice roll through them like thunder. "Horus is dead," he began, the words striking like a blade. "The Emperor is not a god. but a tyrant who bleeds, his empire dry. And the gods you whisper to are liars, feeding on your weakness. You think you are broken, that you are nothing but carrion for them to gnaw on. But I tell you this, we are not done. The galaxy is not theirs to command, nor his. It is ours. Ours to burn, ours to claim, ours to shatter. We will not kneel. We will not beg. We will take what was denied us and carve it into eternity. The hall erupted with voices, roars of rage and approval, the sound of chains being broken in the hearts of men who had known only despair. For the first time since Horus's fall, they felt not only memory, but purpose. They looked upon Abaddon and saw not just the first captain, but something rising from ruin, a leader who refused to bow to gods or tyrants, a weapon forged of fury and loss. Yet as their voices echoed, Abaddon felt the storm pressing closer, the warp itself listening. He knew the gods had heard his defiance, and that they would not forget it. Their whispers coiled like smoke around his heart, tempting, mocking, promising. He clenched the talon tighter, as though its weight could anchor him against eternity. When the roars faded and silence returned, Abaddon spoke once more, his voice quieter, but every word a vow. Horus failed because he believed. I will not fail because I do not. I will build no dream, no false hope. I will build only war, and through war I will endure. The warriors bowed their heads, not in worship, but in recognition. And in that moment, Abaddon felt the fracture within himself harden into resolve. He was no longer only a son mourning his father. He was the beginning of something the galaxy would learn to fear. Yet deep within, in the silence no vow could banish, he heard Horus's voice, faint and accusing. And Abaddon knew that no matter how far he rose, the shadow of that failure would follow him, whispering until the end of time. The Eye of Terror did not welcome him as a conqueror, but as prey. Its storms rolled like oceans of color, bleeding crimson into violet, emerald into shadow. And through its endless tides moved shapes too vast, too ancient for mortal thought. Ships that entered its borders rarely returned, their hulls twisted, their crews consumed, their names erased. Yet Abaddon did not flinch, as the vengeful spirit, the flagship that had once carried Horus to terror, plunged deeper into its heart. He stood upon its bridge with the certainty of a man who had nothing left to fear. And yet within him a quiet dread coiled like smoke, whispering that even he could be unmade here. The warriors behind him tried to look resolute, but he saw the falter in their stares, the tremor in their hands as the warp pressed against their minds. In the eye, faith, memory, even identity could be swallowed whole. It was here that destinies were either broken or reborn. The storm parted for a moment, revealing a vast plain of shattered rock adrift in endless void. Towers jutted from its surface, broken like bones, remnants of a civilization that had never existed in reality but persisted here as echoes. Abaddon ordered the fleet to anchor, though anchors meant little in this sea without stars. He descended alone, his armor hissing as it adjusted to the strange air, his boots striking against stone that felt older than time. The landscape was silent, yet he felt the weight of presence pressing on him from every angle. Unseen eyes watching, unseen mouths whispering. It was as though the gods themselves were drawing breath, waiting to see what he would do. The ruins rose around him, monoliths carved with symbols that shifted when he tried to look at them, twisting into shapes that suggested meanings too vast to hold. He walked among them as a trespasser in another's dream, and with each step, memories not his own pressed against him. Wars fought before humanity crawled from its cradle, civilizations rising only to collapse in fire. empires shattering beneath the same ambition that now burned within him. It was a mirror, and in it he saw both promise and warning. A voice reached him then, not in sound, but in thought, a thunder that echoed through his skull. Ezekiel Abaddon, it said, vast and cold, neither man nor beast, but something eternal. You carry the talon, you bear the shadow of Horus, you stand at the threshold of eternity. Why do you resist what was always meant to be? Abaddon clenched his fists, his breath misting in the alien air. Because I will not be a puppet, he said into the silence. I saw what you did to him. I saw you hollow him out and make him nothing. I will not wear those chains. I will not bow. The laughter that followed was not cruel, but patient, as though speaking to a child who had yet to learn. Bow. You misunderstand. We do not ask you to bow. We ask you to claim. Horus faltered because he doubted. He sought freedom where none exists. You are stronger. You see that only war is real. You see that eternity belongs to those who seize it. Take our gift, and no one will stand before you. Not the Emperor, not the Imperium, not even the memory of Horus. The air thickened, shimmering with images that burned against his mind. He saw himself leading vast armadas across the galaxy, entire sectors burning at his command. He saw his name carved into the fabric of reality itself, not as a shadow of another, but as a force all his own, eternal, unbroken, unchallenged. The vision seared him with its promise, and for a moment he felt the pull of it, the hunger of a man who had lost too much, and now saw a path to reclaim more than he had ever known. But beneath the grandeur, he saw also the chains, thin and unseen, but there all the same. Every gift bound him closer. Every promise hid a leash. He thought of Horus's eyes in the last moments of his life, not filled with defiance, but with despair, realizing too late that he was not master but slave. Abaddon's fury flared, his voice tearing against the silence. If eternity means chains, I choose mortality. If power means surrender, I choose wrath. I will take nothing from you that I cannot claim as mine. If I am to rise, it will not be by your will, but by my own. The storm above cracked open, spilling light that was not light, but raw madness across the ruins. The ground shuddered as though angered, the towers screaming as their impossible geometry collapsed into dust. The voice that had filled him roared in 1,000 tongues, and in that roar he felt neither hatred nor rejection, but approval. They wanted him to resist. They wanted him to burn. They wanted him to fight until even defiance itself became a form of worship. He turned his gaze skyward, armor reflecting the chaos as he raised the talon. I will make war until there is nothing left but ashes. I will shatter the Imperium, break the false god upon his throne, and from the ruin of both you and him, I will carve a throne that belongs to me alone. That is my vow. The storm calmed, settling into a silence more dangerous than fury. A figure emerged from the dust, not demon, not man, but something between. Its form shifted with every glance, now a warrior, now a beast, now a god. It bowed its head as though acknowledging him, and when it spoke, its voice was quiet. Then you are chosen, though you do not name it. Rise, Abaddon, for every oath binds you closer, and every vow feeds us. We will wait. We will always wait. The figure dissolved, leaving only the whisper of its presence in the ruin. Abaddon stood alone again, but he felt the weight of unseen hands pressing upon his shoulders, the recognition of powers that had marked him not as a puppet, but as something far more dangerous, a man who believed himself free. When he returned to the ship, his warriors saw the fire in his eyes and fell silent. They did not ask what had transpired in the ruins, for they felt it in the air, heavy and inescapable. Ezekiel Abaddon had stepped into the heart of the storm and returned unbroken. Whatever he had found there had not consumed him, but tempered him. He walked among them no longer only as first captain, but as something they could not name. Not yet, but soon. In his private chamber, he removed his gauntlet and stared at his hand. It trembled faintly, not with fear, but with the echo of power that had brushed against him. He thought again of Horus, of the laughter of the gods, of the promises that had been both gifts and curses. He clenched his hand until the tremor stilled. He would not falter. He would not be hollowed. The storm raged outside, but within, Abaddon was calm. He had glimpsed the abyss, and he had spoken into it not as a slave, but as a master in the making. The path ahead would be paved with blood, betrayal, and endless war, but it would be his. And for the first time since Horus's death, he felt not only grief, not only rage, but purpose. The summons went out like a ripple of thunder across the eye, carried by warp-touched messengers and whispers borne on tides of madness. Legions that had once marched together beneath the banner of the Great Crusade now drifted like shattered glass in a sea of chaos, each fragment gleaming with its own pride, its own scars. Some answered with eagerness, smelling the promise of blood and dominion. Others came with suspicion, dragging their fleets like wounded beasts, wary of yet another pretender who would speak of unity and end in ruin. But they came nonetheless, drawn by the force of Abaddon's call, or by curiosity, or by the gnawing hunger for a leader strong enough to bind them. The meeting place was an ancient citadel, adrift upon a blackened asteroid, its spires clawing upward like broken fingers toward the storm. Built by no mortal hand, it had stood long before man's first steps into the stars, its stones pulsing faintly as though alive, its halls resonating with the memory of old empires drowned in the warp. There, beneath arches that seemed to shift when no one looked, the champions of treachery gathered. The air stank of sorcery, of blood rituals, of the ozone reek of weapons too long awakened. Abaddon entered last, his stride heavy but unyielding, the talon of Horus glowing faintly in the light of witchfire torches. The gathered lords fell silent, some bowing their heads out of instinct, others narrowing their eyes in defiance. The sight of him was a provocation in itself, for the talon carried memory heavier than any throne, and many among them had bled for Horus only to see him fall. They wondered if this first captain would claim that legacy or desecrate it. 1,000 Suns' sorcerer was first to speak, his voice a coil of silk and poison. Ezekiel Abaddon, he said, the syllables drawn out as though tasting them. You call us from our dominions, from wars of our own choosing, to gather here in this tomb of ghosts. Do you seek to crown yourself War Master? Shall we kneel as we once knelt to Horus, only to watch you bleed out his fate? A murmur of agreement rippled through the chamber. A World-Eater's champion laughed aloud, his armor still slick with gore from some forgotten slaughter. If he dares claim it, I will test him myself. Horus was a god of war. This one is only a man who clings to his father's corpse. His laughter echoed, brutal and mocking, daring Abaddon to answer with steel. But Abaddon did not draw his blade. He let the silence stretch until it became heavier than chains. His gaze moved from one lord to the next, iron warriors with their scarred metallic flesh, night lords with eyes gleaming like predators, word-bearers with mouths muttering half-heard prayers. He saw in them not unity but hunger, not loyalty but opportunity, and he understood. They were not his enemies, not yet, but neither were they allies. They were rivals, waiting to see if he was strong enough to command or weak enough to devour. When he spoke, his voice was iron, steady, and resonant. I do not ask you to kneel. I do not ask you to name me War Master. Horus was War Master, and Horus failed. He failed because he trusted gods who lied, and a vision that crumbled. I will not make his mistake. His words cut through the chamber like a blade. The sorcerer frowned, the World Eater growled, but the others leaned forward, drawn by the defiance. Abaddon raised the talon, its claws catching the light. You are broken, scattered, lost in the eye like carrion. The Imperium laughs at you. They call you fallen, forgotten. You squabble like children while they rebuild their strength. I offer you nothing but war. Not peace, not empire. War without end. War until the false god's throne is drowned in blood and the stars themselves burn. Follow me, and we will make the galaxy tremble again. Refuse, and remain scavengers gnawing bones. For a moment, the hall was silent. Then the World Eater roared, striding forward with chain axe raised, his eyes wild with rage. Big words for a man wearing another's gauntlet. Let us see if you can bleed as well as you boast. He charged, the floor cracking beneath his stride, his weapon screaming as it bit the air. Abaddon did not flinch. He waited until the last instant, then moved with the precision of centuries of war. The talon of Horus shot forward, claws igniting with warp light as they tore through the champion's chest. Blood and sparks exploded, the World Eater's laughter turning into a wet gurgle before silence claimed him. Abaddon cast the body aside like refuse, his voice cold. This is the price of doubt. The chamber stirred with unease. Some looked at him with newfound respect, others with deeper hatred, but none could deny the display. The talon dripped blood onto the stone floor, and Abaddon let it fall without cleaning it. I will not beg for loyalty, he said. I will take it. Those who follow me will do so because they fear me, or because they see what I will build. Those who oppose me will die as he did. Choose now. One by one, voices rose. Some shouted allegiance, eager to ride behind strength. Others remained silent, their eyes calculating, weighing whether to submit now or bide their time until betrayal could strike deeper. The sorcerer's smile was faint, as though he had foreseen this moment long before. Yet even he bowed his head, acknowledging that the galaxy had shifted. That night, the warlords feasted on the corpse of their fallen peer, as was their custom, but in their eyes burned something sharper than ritual hunger. They had seen a fracture filled. They had seen a leader who could speak in defiance of gods, yet command the terror of men. They had seen a shadow step out from Horus' ruin and begin to shape itself into something new. In his chamber, Abaddon removed his armor, piece by piece, his body scarred with wounds that never healed. He sat in the half-dark, staring at the talon where it rested on the table. Its claws glowed faintly, as though whispering their own hunger. He thought of the World Eater's laughter, of the sorcerer's eyes, of the countless blades still pointed at his back, even as they pledged their oaths. Leadership in this age was not built on loyalty, but on fear, and fear was a blade that cut both ways. He felt the gods watching, their whispers brushing his mind, praising his defiance even as they claimed it as their own. He clenched his fists, forcing their voices into silence. They would not own him. They could not. And yet he knew the truth. Every step he took bound him tighter to the path they wanted. Every act of war feeding the hunger that sustained them. He was building his freedom with the very chains he despised. Outside, the eye raged, storms clawing against the citadel's towers. Inside, beneath the banners of legions long broken, Abaddon sat in silence, his mind heavy with memory and resolve. He had taken his first step not as Horus's heir, but as his successor in something darker. He did not need a crown nor a title. He needed only war. And though none yet spoke it aloud, though none dared name it, in the shadows of that citadel, the birth of a new war master had begun. The forge was older than humanity's first spark of fire, buried deep within the bones of a dead world that drifted at the edge of the eye. Its surface was a wasteland of ash and jagged rock, but beneath lay chambers that burned with a heat that never faded. Furnaces stoked by energies no mortal engine could sustain. Here, weapons had been wrought in ages long forgotten. Blades that sang with curses, armor that remembered its wearers, engines that bled when struck. It was to this place that Abaddon descended, his warriors at his back, the weight of purpose heavier than the air that pressed against them. The halls trembled with the echo of ancient machinery. Chains thicker than ships hung from the ceiling, dragging titanic slabs of metal that pulsed like muscle. Sparks fell like rain, each one burning with a strange life before vanishing into the shadows. Abaddon moved through the gloom without hesitation, the talon of Horus clenched at his side, its claws flickering faintly as though recognizing the presence of a place where legends were born. His men kept their distance, for they felt it too, that this was no forge built by mortals, but a sanctum where oaths became iron and ambition became weapon. At the heart of the chamber stood a throne of black stone, and upon it a figure robed in filth and flame. Its face was hidden by a mask of iron, its hands long and twisted, blackened by the labor of millennia. When it spoke, its voice was like metal grinding against bone. First Captain, bearer of the Talon, you have come to reforge what is broken. Abaddon's voice was steady, though it carried the weight of centuries of bitterness. I come to claim what was Horus and make it mine, not as a son who imitates, but as a master who surpasses. His weapon is my burden, and I will see it, remade in my name. The figure laughed, sparks spilling from its mouth like embers. You carry his shadow as a curse. Do you think a forge can strip it away? Do you think fire can cleanse the memory of failure? Abaddon stepped forward, the storm of the warp echoing faintly in his words. Fire does not cleanse. Fire remakes. Horus's talon was his. This one will be mine. I will not wield his ghost. I will wield a symbol of my war. The Forge Master rose, towering above even Abaddon, its body a blend of demon and machine, bound by chains of rusted gold. With a gesture, the furnaces roared, spilling light across the chamber. The talon of Horus glowed in answer, its claws twitching as though eager for rebirth. Very well, the Forge Master said, but know this, every reforging is a covenant. What is broken can only be remade by sacrifice. Abaddon placed the talon upon the altar of stone. Its claws screamed as they touched the surface, sparks erupting as though in defiance. The Forge Master's hands descended, wrapping around the gauntlet, and the air split with the sound of molten metal tearing. Visions flared around them. Horus standing upon the bridge of the vengeful spirit, his eyes hollow with corruption. The Emperor's strike, blinding in its fury. The moment when the War Master's dream died in silence. Abaddon felt them claw into his mind, dragging at his resolve, testing the cracks in his defiance. He did not resist the visions. He let them burn. He let them remind him of what had been lost, of what must never be repeated. His voice rose above the din. I am not Horus. I am not his heir. I am the hand that will tear down his failure and build something greater. The forge blazed brighter, the talon's claws melting, reshaping, drinking deep of the warp's fury. The Forge Master's laughter became a chant, each word older than stars, each syllable binding power into steel. Abaddon's warriors fell to their knees as the weight of it pressed upon them. Yet Abaddon stood firm, his eyes locked on the weapon that was becoming his own. He felt the gods watching, their approval and hunger entwined, their whispers urging him to accept, to surrender. He bared his teeth and spat into the fire. "You will not own me. This is mine, my war, my will." The flames answered with a roar, and when they dimmed, the talon lay remade. Its claws were longer, sharper, each etched with runes that writhed like living things. The metal was black as the void, yet glowed with a faint inner light, as though it contained the memory of suns extinguished. Abaddon lifted it, and for the first time, the weight did not feel borrowed. It did not feel like Horus. It felt like him. The Forge Master bowed, chains rattling. "It is done. But remember, every weapon forged in this place drinks from its master. It will grow stronger with your wars, and weaker if you falter. You have claimed it, but it has claimed you also." Abaddon turned, the talon clenching with a sound like thunder. "So be it. Let it drink. Let it hunger. It will never thirst long while I breathe." His warriors lowered their heads, awe and fear mingling as they looked upon him. The reforged talon was more than a weapon. It was a declaration, a living symbol, that Horus was no longer the measure of their rebellion. Abaddon had stepped from his father's shadow, and in doing so, he had created something terrible and new. As they departed the Forge world, the storms of the eye seemed to part, just for a moment. The stars beyond flickered faintly, as though even the void acknowledged what had been born. Abaddon stood at the prow of the vengeful spirit, the talon glimmering faintly against the darkness. He thought of Horus, of the Emperor, of the gods who whispered still. Let them watch. Let them hunger. He would use them all and be used by none. In the silence of the void, he whispered to himself, a vow that carried into eternity. This is the beginning, not of Horus's dream, not of the god's will, the beginning of mine, and mine will never end. The talon answered with a flicker of fire, as though it too had heard, and somewhere, deep within the eye of terror, the gods smiled, knowing that in defiance lay the truest form of devotion. The air within the vengeful spirit had grown heavier in the weeks following the reforging of the talon. Shadows lingered longer in the corners of its halls, and whispers carried through the steel like veins of blood beneath skin. Abaddon walked them in silence, feeling the shift not as a burden, but as inevitability. Power drew envy. Resolve bred fear. Where fear gathered, betrayal was never far behind. He did not need the warnings of his captains to know it. The tension was alive in the very walls of the ship, in the way warriors watched one another with hands brushing their blades, in the silence that fell whenever he entered a chamber. Unity had been won with spectacle, but unity was brittle when bound only by fear. He had expected this. He had welcomed it. Among his lieutenants was Kaled, once a captain of the sons of Horus, scarred and cunning, whose tongue was as sharp as any blade. Kaled had fought beside Abaddon on Terra, had shed blood for Horus, and in the years of exile had become a voice many listened to in the shadows. He had been loyal once, but loyalty in the eye was a currency that bought nothing but suspicion. Abaddon had heard the whispers of his plotting, of private meetings in the lower decks, of promises made to those who still clung to Horus's memory like a dying flame. Kaled spoke of resurrection, of a true war master who would return, reborn by the gods' favor, to lead them as before. It was an old lie, but in the dark, even lies had teeth. Abaddon did not move against him immediately. He let the poison spread, watching, listening, measuring the weight of betrayal. To rule these men was not to silence dissent, but to wield it, to use it as a test. He had said he would not beg for loyalty. Now he would prove that loyalty was not a gift, but a fire that consumed all who doubted. The summons came when he chose it, a council in the great hall beneath banners blackened and frayed, where the gathered warlords stood in the flickering red of torchlight. The air stank of oil and blood. They ringed the chamber like predators circling prey, waiting to see if strength would falter or rise. Keled was there, his eyes cold, his armor scarred with the marks of too many battles fought for causes long dead. He stepped forward before Abaddon could speak, his voice carrying like steel striking stone. "You claim to lead us," Keled said, his tone sharpened for all to hear. "But what are you, Ezekiel Abaddon? You wear Horus's gauntlet. You speak of war without end. Yet I see no empire, no throne, no victory. You drag us into storms and call it destiny. Perhaps you are nothing but a man who clings to ghosts, afraid to admit you will never be what he was." The words struck like a lash across the hall. Murmurs rippled, some in agreement, some in warning. Abaddon stood unmoving, the talon of Horus glinting faintly in the gloom. His silence was heavier than any reply. He let it stretch until the murmurs turned uneasy, until the weight of anticipation threatened to break the hall apart. Then he spoke, voice low but resonant with iron. "Horus is dead, and so too will be any who claim his name without the strength to bear it. You call me afraid, Keled? No, I am what he was not. I do not beg the gods for visions. I do not kneel in hope of crowns. I am war itself, and war bows to no one." Keled's lips twisted into a sneer. "Then prove it." He drew his blade, a relic scarred by centuries, its edge glowing with runes that hissed at the air. The hall erupted in shouts, the crowd pulling back to form a ring, their eyes gleaming with hunger. They wanted blood, not words. Abaddon did not hesitate. He raised the talon, its claws shimmering with warp light, and stepped into the circle. The silence that followed was electric, the kind of silence before thunder breaks the sky. Keled lunged first, his blade screaming as it cut the air. Abaddon met him with a speed that belied his bulk, the talon catching the strike, sparks spraying as metal clashed with cursed steel. The impact rattled the hall, and the warriors roared their approval. They fought like brothers turned predators, every strike echoing with memory. Keled was skilled, his blade darting with precision, his body moving with the instinct of centuries of war. But Abaddon was relentless. Each blow he struck was not only against Keled, but against the ghost of Horus, against the weight of doubt, against the whisper of chains that threatened to bind him. The talon lashed forward, claws tearing gouges in armor, ripping sparks from stone. Keled staggered, but his eyes blazed with defiance, his voice a snarl. "You will never be him." "I am not him," Abaddon answered, driving forward, each word punctuated by a strike. "I am what he could not be. I am the end." The duel ended as swiftly as it had begun. Keled struck high, desperate for a killing blow, but Abaddon's movement was precise, inevitable. The talons surged upward, claws piercing through Keled's chest, lifting him from the ground in a spray of blood. Silence fell as his body spasmed, his blade clattering to the floor. Abaddon held him there, raised high for all to see, his voice echoing like a verdict. "This is the price of doubt. This is the fate of those who dream of ghosts while I build war." With a final surge, he crushed Keled's body in the talon, casting it aside, broken and lifeless. The hall erupted in roars, some in fear, others in fervor. The sound rolled through the chamber like thunder, a tide that could not be denied. Abaddon stood in the center, drenched in blood, his breath steady, his eyes unyielding. He did not raise his weapon in triumph. He did not smile. He only stood, immovable, unbroken, the embodiment of what they had seen. Not Horus, not a puppet of gods, but something greater, something terrible. In the silence that followed the storm of voices, every man in that hall understood. Abaddon did not ask for loyalty. He had taken it, carved it into their hearts with blood and fear. They would follow him not because he demanded it, but because none could deny what he had become. Later, in the solitude of his chamber, Abaddon sat in the half-dark, the talon resting on the table beside him, still slick with Khaled's blood. He stared at it, remembering the words of the Forge Master. Every weapon claimed its master as much as the master claimed the weapon. He wondered if Khaled had seen truth in his last breath, if perhaps Abaddon was becoming the very thing he swore to defy, a creature bound by power, forged by the same chains he despised. But then he looked beyond the doubts, into the storm outside, and he felt the fire burn steady within him. He was not Horus. He was not servant. He was war given form, and war could not be caged. The talon pulsed faintly in the gloom, as though agreeing, as though alive. Abaddon closed his eyes, his voice a whisper meant for no one but himself. Let them betray. Let them test. Each blade turned against me only proves I endure, and I will endure until the last star burns out. The ship trembled as the warp howled beyond its hull, but within, a single man sat unbroken, and the galaxy's fate darkened with the certainty of his resolve. The First Crusade did not begin with a proclamation, nor with the raising of banners, but with the silent movement of fleets slipping from the eye like shadows from a wound. The vengeful spirit led them, its vast hull scarred by centuries, its engines burning with the fury of a beast straining at its chains. Around it gathered ships of every design and origin, some relics of the Great Crusade, others warped beyond recognition by their long years in the warp. They did not form a disciplined armada, but a storm, a tide of broken war bands bound by Abaddon's will, each eager to bleed the Imperium and carve their names into its scars. Abaddon stood upon the command deck as the stars wheeled into place before him, his gaze fixed on the void beyond. He had promised war, and war had come. Yet in the silence of his mind, he felt the weight of what was beginning. Every crusade would bind him further, not only to his warriors, but to the gods who watched. He despised their whispers, yet he knew their laughter grew each time he spoke of endless war. They did not need his worship. They only needed his wrath. And wrath was the one currency he could never exhaust. The first target lay ahead, a cluster of imperial worlds on the border of Segmentum Obscurus, bastions guarding the routes between the Eye of Terror and the heart of the Imperium. Cadia loomed among them, fortress world and gatekeeper, its defenses a knife aimed at the throat of any who dared to emerge. To strike at Cadia was folly. To strike near it was to send a message. Abaddon had chosen neither conquest nor suicide, but terror. The Imperium thrived on faith. To wound it, he would unravel faith with fear. The fleets descended upon the First World without warning. Its skies darkened as the ships bled from the warp, fire trailing their hulls, demonic shapes coiling around their prows. The defenses crumbled in hours, orbital stations torn apart by lance fire, their wreckage raining down upon cities that screamed but could not resist. Abaddon ordered no occupation, no claim of dominion. He ordered fire. The oceans boiled as bombardments split continents. Towers that had stood for centuries toppled into dust. Billions cried out, and the warp drank their agony like wine. Abaddon did not watch the slaughter with triumph. He stood in silence as the world burned, his warriors roaring their chants, their bloodlust spilling across the void. He felt no joy, no release, only a grim certainty. This was not conquest. This was declaration. Let the Imperium see smoke upon its borders. Let its priests choke on the stench of their own helplessness. The Black Crusades would not be wars of victory, but of corrosion. A long, slow death, delivered blow by blow, until the Emperor's corpse throne sat in silence. In the aftermath, his lieutenants gathered in the strategium, their voices sharp, clashing like blades. Some demanded more worlds burned, others cried for invasion, for Cadia itself to be taken in Horus's name. They spat the words Warmaster as though daring him to claim it. Abaddon let them argue until their fury dulled into repetition, then raised his hand and the chamber fell silent. Horus sought terror, he said, his voice cutting like iron, and he failed. I will not repeat his failure. I will not waste lives chasing thrones when the galaxy itself is my weapon. We are not conquerors. We are not rulers. We are war. Every strike we make weakens them. Every life we take feeds the gods they pretend to deny. I do not need Cadia today. I need the Imperium to fear me tomorrow. The words settled like ash. They did not cheer, but neither did they resist. They understood, though many hated the understanding. To live in the eye was to hunger for triumph, for crowns of bone, for empires of fire. But Abaddon's war was not for empires. It was for erosion. It was for the breaking of faith itself. When the fleets moved on, the Imperium bled again. Another world burned, then another, until 5 lay in ruin, their names erased in screams. Word spread like plague, faster than light could travel. Rumors carried by refugees spoke of Horus reborn, of a dark warlord who wielded the talon and bore the fury of gods. Imperial commanders debated whether he was shadow or truth, but the priests already whispered his name with dread. Abaddon, the Despoiler. And yet, even as his legend grew, Abaddon felt the hollowness within him deepen. Each victory fed the gods, and he could feel them feeding in return, their whispers curling tighter around his soul. They praised him, promising him crowns, offering visions of thrones built on bones, of eternity carved from the screams of a billion worlds. He spat their promises back into the void, but still they lingered, patient, knowing that every vow of defiance chained him closer. On the bridge of the vengeful spirit, Abaddon stared into the stars, his gauntlet glowing faintly with the light of souls consumed. Varus, ever faithful, approached him, his voice low. You have given them war, Ezekiel. They chant your name as Warmaster. Do you not hear it? Do you not claim it? Abaddon did not turn. His gaze remained fixed on the dying light of the world behind them. I am not Warmaster, he said. That was Horus's title, and it died with him. I do not lead for crowns. I lead because war demands a hand to wield it. Let them call me what they will. I am the beginning of the end. That is enough. Varus bowed his head, though unease lingered in his eyes. He, like so many others, still clung to the echo of Horus, still sought names to bind meaning to this endless war. But Abaddon knew there was no meaning, no crown, no dream. Only war, and through war, eternity. The crusade ended as swiftly as it began. The fleet slipped back into the eye, vanishing into the storm, leaving only ruin in their wake. Imperial scribes recorded the damage, tallying the dead, assigning names to the lost worlds. But no number could capture the true cost. It was not the billions dead, nor the cities burned. It was the silence that spread across the Imperium, the whispered doubt in its prayers. Faith cracked not by conquest, but by fear. In the eye, Abaddon stood alone in his chamber, the talon resting upon the table, its claws twitching faintly as though alive. He thought of Horus, of terror, of all that had been lost. He thought of Kiled's last sneer, of the gods' laughter, of the fragile unity of the warbands now bound to him by blood. He knew they would betray again. He knew the gods would whisper louder. He knew the Imperium would never stop resisting. And yet, he also knew the truth. The first Black Crusade had begun, and the galaxy would never again know peace. Each crusade would bleed it further. Each wound would fester. Each whisper of his name would spread. He did not need victory. He only needed war. He closed his eyes, letting the silence of the chamber settle around him, his voice a vow spoken into the void. This is only the first. There will be others. There will always be others, until the last light dies. The storm outside howled in answer, and Abaddon listened, unblinking, as though the galaxy itself had bowed its head in recognition. The Eye of Terror never slept, but it shifted. Its storms curled inward, swallowing fragments of time and spitting them out in new forms, moments of the past colliding with futures that might never be. It was in this place of fractured eternity that Abaddon returned after the First Crusade, his fleets trailing behind him like wolves who had tasted blood. They were sated for the moment, their hulls blackened, their bellies swollen with plunder, their warriors drunk on slaughter. Yet satisfaction was a fragile thing. It turned quickly to hunger again, and hunger was the eye's truest language. The warbands gathered on the vengeful spirit, called by Abaddon's command. They filled the great hall, their armor clashing, their voices raised in argument. The blood of imperial citizens still clung to their gauntlets, but already they demanded more. Some cried for new crusades, others for dominion within the eye. Beneath their shouts lay rivalry, sharpened like blades, and Abaddon saw it clearly. Their unity was still shallow, bound by fear of him more than faith in his cause. He had forged them into a storm, but storms always threatened to break apart. He entered the hall with the talon gleaming faintly in the torchlight. Silence struck them like a hammer, though hatred still smouldered in many eyes. He walked slowly to the dais, his gaze meeting theirs one by one, until no voice dared rise against him. Then he spoke, his words heavy as iron. You demand more war. It will come. You demand more spoils. They will flow. But understand this. There will be no crown, no empire, no peace. You do not follow me for what I give. You follow me because without me, you are nothing but carrion. The Imperium laughs at scavengers. With me, it will learn to tremble again. Some roared their approval. Others muttered in discontent, whispering names of old leaders, old dreams. Among them, Abaddon saw the seeds of betrayal still sprouting, and he knew the time had come to strike deeper, to cut away those who would challenge his dominion. He would not wait for daggers in the dark. He would draw them into the light. When the hall emptied, a figure lingered at the edge of shadow. A champion of the word-bearers, his armor engraved with burning scripture, his eyes fever-bright. You bind them with fear, the man said, his voice carrying both reverence and accusation. But fear is fleeting. Faith endures. Even the gods know this. Abaddon studied him in silence, then spoke. Faith is another chain. I saw what faith did to Horus. It rotted him from within until he was nothing but their vessel. I will not repeat his failure. The word-bearer bowed slightly, his expression unreadable. Then beware. Others whisper already. They say the gods favor not you, but another, a rival who gathers his strength in the storm. claiming visions Horus himself once saw. Abaddon did not reply. He dismissed the man with a gesture, but the words lingered. A rival. The eye was vast, and rivals were as common as shadows. But this whisper carried weight, for it stirred unease even in his own captains. He would face it, not with denial, but with fire. Days later, the rival revealed himself. A warlord of the Black Legion's fractured kin, one who had once fought under Horus, but now claimed that the true warmaster would rise not from defiance, but from worship. He gathered warbands to his side, preaching that Abaddon was nothing but a thief of legacies, a pretender clinging to Horus's gauntlet. He named himself heir chosen of the gods, and his followers cried his name with fervor. It was not the first time such a rival had risen, but this one had gathered too many, too quickly. Abaddon answered with challenge. He summoned the warlord and his followers to a plain of broken rock adrift in the eye, a place where battles older than mankind still echoed in the air. They came, filling the horizon with ships and banners, eager to see which of the two would bleed and which would stand. The armies formed ranks, a sea of black and crimson, their voices rising in chants that shook the ruins. At the center, Abaddon strode forward, the talon gleaming, his gaze locked on his rival. The warlord approached in turn, clad in armor scarred with scripture, his blade burning with the warp's fire. He raised it high and shouted for all to hear. "Behold, the pretender stands. He is no warmaster. He is no chosen. He is only a shadow clinging to Horus's corpse. Today we cut that shadow away." The roar that followed was deafening. The crowd demanded blood. Abaddon did not raise his voice to answer. He only raised the talon, its claws sparking, and stepped forward. The duel was thunder. The warlord's blade crashed against the talon, sparks flying as warp and steel collided. Each strike echoed across the plain, shaking the stones, rattling the bones of ancient ruins. The rival was strong, fueled by zeal and the favor of gods who whispered through his every movement. But Abaddon was relentless. His strikes carried not only strength, but certainty, a cold, implacable will that refused to bend. They clashed again and again, their blows carving scars into the earth. The rival screamed oaths to the gods, his voice frenzied, his blade dripping fire. Abaddon answered only with silence, each movement precise, each strike deliberate. He fought not as a zealot, but as war itself, cold, inevitable, eternal. At last, the rival faltered. His blade met the talon and was caught. Abaddon twisted, wrenching it aside, and drove his claws into the warlord's chest. Blood and fire erupted. The rival's scream tearing through the storm. Abaddon lifted him high, his voice carrying across the plain. This is the fate of those who cling to faith. This is the fate of those who mistake the gods' laughter for strength. I am not chosen. I am not heir. I am inevitable. With a final surge, he tore the rival apart, casting his broken body to the ground. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. Then the roar began, not in dissent, but in submission. The warbands bowed their heads, some in fear, others in awe. The rivals' followers scattered, their faith shattered, their voices silenced. Abaddon stood above them, blood dripping from the talon, his breath steady. He felt the gods watching, their approval thick in the air, but he did not bow. He looked upon the ruin of his rival and saw not victory, but necessity. This was the cost of unity in the eye. This was the price of leadership. That night, in the solitude of his chamber, he sat once more with the talon resting at his side. He thought of Horus, of Kaled, of the rival he had slain. He thought of the gods' laughter, of the way every victory bound him closer to their will, even as he defied them. He wondered if one day he too would be hollowed out, his name remembered not as defiance but as submission. And yet, when he rose, his resolve was unchanged. He would not kneel. He would not be a puppet. Let the gods laugh. Let rivals rise. He would tear them all down until only war remained. In the depths of the eye, the storms howled in agreement, and Abaddon's shadow stretched further than it ever had before. The eye of terror opened like a wound as Abaddon descended deeper into its heart, further than most dared to travel. The storms grew heavier here, not only of light and colour, but of memory and madness. Fleets that strayed too far were devoured, their hulls drifting back centuries later as skeletal shells crewed by whispers. Yet Abaddon pressed forward, the vengeful spirit carving a path through impossible tides, its hull groaning as though in protest. His lieutenants questioned nothing aloud, though he felt the unease radiating from them like a second heat. They had seen him face rivals, seen him claim victory, but this was something different. This was not conquest. This was pilgrimage. In his private chamber, Abaddon stared into the void as though it were a mirror. The reforged talon rested on the table, pulsing faintly as if alive. It had grown heavier with every crusade, every life it claimed. The Forge Master had spoken truth. The weapon drank from its wielder as much as it slew enemies. He could feel it now in his bones, a slow erosion. The edge of his humanity scraped thinner with each war. And yet he could not discard it. It was his symbol, his burden, his bond. To abandon it would be to abandon himself. He closed his eyes, and the warp pressed closer. Voices rose, 1,000 murmurs overlapping, promises of crowns, of dominion, of eternity. But within them another voice bled through, familiar, hated, and yet still burning with memory. Horus. Abaddon heard it as he had on the decks of the vengeful spirit in ages past. Not the broken whisper of a fallen warlord, but the commanding resonance of the war master he had once loved. It spoke not in words, but in the shape of regret, in the echo of betrayal, in the agony of knowing he had been nothing more than a puppet. Abaddon's jaw tightened. Even in death, Horus would not release him. Driven by the vision, Abaddon ordered the ship deeper into the eye, toward a place few dared name aloud. A world adrift in eternal storm, a graveyard of gods long forgotten, where legends said even the ruinous powers had once quarreled. His lieutenants whispered of madness, of doom, but he silenced them with a single look. "We go where war leads us," he said, his voice iron. "And war leads here." The world appeared at last through the storm, a black sphere cracked with rivers of fire, its skies torn by lightning the color of blood. The ground was littered with titanic bones, some resembling beasts, others shapes too alien to comprehend. Monuments rose from the ash, crumbling towers etched with runes that shifted when seen from the corner of the eye. The air trembled with power, ancient and malignant. This was not a world of mortals. It was a reliquary of gods. Abaddon descended alone. His warriors begged to follow, but he denied them. "If I return, you will know I have endured. If I do not, then no escort could have saved me." His boots struck the ash, each step sinking into a soil that seemed to breathe. The talon burned faintly, its claws scraping against the air as though eager for the challenge. Abaddon's eyes narrowed. He had come seeking truth. But truth in the eye was never given. It was wrested from the teeth of eternity. The ruins swallowed him, their shadows bending as though alive. He walked through avenues, lined with statues of beings whose faces were eroded, but whose gazes still pressed upon him. Whispers followed, rising into a chorus. He saw visions of himself, crowned in fire, seated upon thrones of skulls. He saw worlds burning, fleets kneeling, even gods bowing. But for every image of triumph, he saw another, himself broken, hollow, devoured as Horus had been. Each step felt like walking between mirrors, one reflecting dominion, the other despair. At the center of the ruins lay a temple, its doors taller than titans, carved from stone that pulsed faintly with light. He entered, the silence inside deeper than death. The chamber stretched impossibly high, its ceiling lost in shadow. At its heart lay a sarcophagus, vast and bound in chains thicker than ships, its surface inscribed with words in 1,000 tongues. It radiated presence, so immense that even Abaddon felt the weight press into his bones. As he approached, the air thickened and the voice returned. Not whisper, not murmur, but roar. Horus. Yet it was not Horus as he remembered him, not the father, not the war master. It was something greater, something fused with the warp, a shadow of what the gods had made him. The sarcophagus trembled, chains rattling, as though something within stirred. "You carry my talon," the voice thundered. "You bear my shadow. Why do you resist what I became? You could finish what I began. You could be more than I ever was." Abaddon's teeth bared. "You were nothing but a puppet. You let them hollow you, wear you like armor, until there was no Horus left. I will not be you. I will not kneel." The laughter that followed shook the temple. "You already kneel, Ezekiel. Every war you wage feeds them. Every oath of defiance binds you closer. You believe yourself free, but you are mine. You are theirs. You are inevitable." Abaddon's rage flared. He raised the talon, its claws burning with warp fire, and drove it into the sarcophagus. Chains shattered, sparks of power erupting as though the very warp screamed. The voice howled, not in pain but in triumph, as if this had always been the end. Visions erupted in Abaddon's mind, of the gods feasting on his fury, of eternity drowning in war, of his name whispered not as defiance but as devotion. He staggered back, his breath ragged, his body trembling. The sarcophagus lay still once more, its surface cracked, its presence dimmed. But the laughter lingered, woven into the air, into his blood, into the talon itself. He had struck at Horus's ghost, and in doing so, had bound himself tighter to the path he despised. He emerged from the temple, his armor scorched, his eyes burning. His warriors knelt when they saw him, for they knew he had faced something beyond mortal comprehension and survived. Abaddon said nothing. He boarded the vengeful spirit in silence, the weight of the encounter pressing against him like a chain he could not break. That night, alone in his chamber, he stared at the talon. Its claws dripped faintly with black fire, its runes alive with hunger. He clenched it until his gauntlet creaked, his voice a whisper. "I am not Horus. I am not theirs. I am war, and war belongs to no one." But in the silence that followed, he heard the laughter again, faint and patient, as though eternity itself had all the time in the galaxy to wait for him to admit otherwise. The warp storms receded behind them as the vengeful spirit tore free of that cursed world, its engines groaning with strain, its hull echoing with the screams of things that had clung to it from the storm. The fleets rejoined, drifting, like wolves in the dark, their prows still dripping the fire of battle lust, their warriors chanting victory hymns. But there was unease among them. They had seen Abaddon descend alone and return changed. His armor scorched, his eyes darker than before. They whispered that he had spoken to gods, that he had bargained with Horus' ghost, that he had seen visions too terrible to name. And though they feared him more than ever, fear did not erase suspicion. In the eye, suspicion was blood waiting for a blade. Abaddon gave no explanations. He walked the decks as if the storm had never touched him, his stride iron, his voice steady when orders were given. Yet within, the weight pressed deeper. The laughter of the temple lingered in his skull, like a scar that throbbed with every thought. He told himself it was only memory, only the gods' attempt to bind him. But memory has a way of growing teeth in the dark. The fleets gathered at the edge of the eye, staring out toward real space. Beyond lay Cadia, its defenses strong, its faith unyielding. It was the bulwark of the Imperium, the fortress that had held back the tides of chaos for millennia. Many among Abaddon's lieutenants urged him to strike. To break Cadia would be to shatter the Imperium's shield, to carve his name into history with fire. Their voices rose in fever, demanding that he claim it in Horus's name, to finish what the War Master had begun. But Abaddon remained silent until their words ran dry. Then he spoke, his tone calm, but carrying the edge of command that none could mistake. Horus sought terror. He sought thrones and crowns, and he failed. I do not seek Cadia, not yet. I do not seek to crown myself in his shadow. I seek war, war eternal. We will bleed them again and again, until they rot from within. Cadia will fall in time, but not today. The hall broke into arguments, but Abaddon's voice silenced them once more. His authority was not questioned with words, but with glares and clenched fists. Still, he saw the hunger in their eyes, the impatience of predators caged too long. He knew what they did not yet admit, that one day he would have to strike Cadia, not because it was wise, but because war itself demanded it. For now, his war turned elsewhere. The fleet slipped into real space, striking imperial outposts and mining colonies, tearing apart convoys and slaughtering worlds whose names the Imperium would one day try to forget. The Crusades became legend, not for victories claimed, but for terror sown. Imperial commanders found themselves chasing shadows, never knowing where the Despoiler would strike next. Priests screamed his name as a curse, and his legend grew larger with every world reduced to ash. Yet still, the hollowness followed him. Alone in his chamber, Abaddon studied the Talon. Its runes writhed faintly, its claws twitching as though hungry for flesh, even in silence. He remembered the words of Horus's ghost, the laughter that had echoed through the temple. Every strike he made, every world he burned, felt like another thread tightening around him. He told himself he was free, but freedom tasted of chains. One night, Varus entered without summons, his face grim. "There are whispers among the warlords," he said quietly. "They speak of a rival rising again, not one of faith this time, but one of ambition. A champion of the Night Lords who claims you have lost the gods' favor. He gathers strength, promising spoils you have denied them." Abaddon's gaze did not waver. Let him gather. Let him whisper. When the time comes, I will silence him as I silenced the others. But Varus lingered, his voice heavy. "Ezekiel, you cannot fight shadows forever. They follow you because you are strong, but strength must be shown again and again. If you do not strike Cadia, if you do not claim something greater, they will turn. Even fear is not eternal." Abaddon turned then, his eyes burning with cold fire. "Fear is eternal, Varus, because I am eternal. Cadia will fall when I choose, not before, not for them, not for you, not for anyone but me." Varus bowed, but unease clung to him like a shadow as he departed. Abaddon sat in silence, his jaw tight, his thoughts heavy. He knew Varus spoke truth, though he would never admit it aloud. Unity bought by fear demanded constant blood, constant spectacle. If he delayed too long, the warbands would fracture again. and he would be forced to waste strength crushing them instead of bleeding the Imperium. And so, he planned. Not Cadia, not yet, but something close enough to feed their hunger. A fortress world on the edge of Segmentum Obscurus, strong enough to tempt, weak enough to bleed. He would strike it down, not for conquest, but for the message it carried, that nowhere was safe, that even the mightiest bulwarks of the Imperium could be torn apart by his hand. The fleets gathered once more, moving through the warp like wolves scenting blood. They fell upon the world with fury, their weapons scorching its skies, their demons spilling across its fields. The defenders fought with faith, with desperation, but faith was no shield against the weight of the Black Legion. Abaddon led from the front, the talon tearing through flesh and steel alike, his presence like a storm that none could stand before. The fortress fell in days, its towers reduced to rubble, its temples drowned in screams. When it was done, Abaddon stood amid the ruins, the talon dripping with blood. His warriors roared his name, their chants echoing across the battlefield, filling the sky with thunder. They called him War Master, they called him Despoiler, they called him Inevitable. But Abaddon felt no triumph. He looked upon the ruin and saw not victory, but necessity. He had fed their hunger, silenced their whispers, for now. But the gods had fed as well, their laughter curling through the warp, thicker, louder, as if each scream was another hymn in their name. He clenched the talon, his voice a whisper only he could hear. I am not Horus. I am not yours. I am war, and war belongs to no one. Yet the laughter did not fade. It lingered in the smoke, in the blood, in the very air he breathed, patient and eternal. And though Abaddon turned from the ruins, ready for the next war, he knew the truth gnawed deeper with every step. He was not fighting only the Imperium. He was fighting the chains of eternity itself. The smoke of the ruined fortress still clung to the vengeful spirit's hull as it drifted back into the storms. The screams of the slaughtered echoed faintly in the warp, carried as offerings to ears unseen. And though his warriors roared in triumph, Abaddon walked the decks in silence. The blood on his gauntlet was still fresh, yet already the victory felt hollow. The gods had fed on the carnage, their whispers pressing harder into his thoughts, weaving themselves into the rhythm of his breath. They promised dominion, called him chosen, hissed visions of thrones built from the bones of terror itself. He clenched the talon until its claws sparked, as if by force alone he could silence them. But silence never lasted long. In the strategium, the lieutenants gathered, their armor still painted with the gore of conquest. The word-bearer chanted praises to the dark gods, his voice a rasping hymn. The World-Eater laughed, demanding that the fleet strike again before their blades grew dull. The Night Lord spoke in low, mocking tones of worlds trembling at the sound of Abaddon's name, but beneath their voices ran the same current as before: hunger. They wanted more blood, more spectacle, more proof that their allegiance was not wasted. They followed him because he was strong, but strength demanded constant sacrifice. Abaddon let them speak, his eyes fixed on the hololithic map of the galaxy, its stars flickering like dying candles. He listened to their demands until their words became repetition, then raised his hand. The chamber fell silent. His voice carried not with thunder, but with cold certainty. You think we are eternal because we burn worlds. You think war is enough. War is nothing without purpose. I am not Horus. I will not waste our strength chasing crowns that mean nothing. We will strike where the Imperium bleeds deepest, where faith falters. That is how it will die. Not in one battle, but in 1,000 cuts, until even the Emperor's corpse rots in silence. The lieutenants bowed their heads, some in obedience, others in frustration. But none dared speak against him. The memory of Khalid's death still lingered in their minds, and they knew Abaddon's patience had limits. Yet when the chamber emptied, one figure remained. A sorcerer of the thousand suns, his eyes glowing like embers within his helm. He stepped forward, his voice low. You cannot fight without them forever, Ezekiel. You cannot wage eternal war without their gifts. Already the gods whisper through you. Already they mark you as theirs. Abaddon's gaze turned upon him, hard as iron. I am theirs as much as they are mine. I use their power, but I do not serve. Horus served, and it destroyed him. I will not kneel. The sorcerer tilted his head, his tone unreadable. Perhaps. Or perhaps every oath of defiance is still a prayer. Perhaps they laugh, not because you resist, but because your resistance is another form of worship. Abaddon's jaw tightened, but he gave no answer. The sorcerer bowed and departed, his words lingering like smoke. Alone once more, Abaddon stared at the star map, the runes etched across its surface shifting as though alive. He thought of Horus, of the sarcophagus bound in chains, of the laughter that had followed him since. Perhaps the sorcerer was right. Perhaps defiance was only another leash. The weeks that followed were restless. The fleets raided, striking supply lines, shattering convoys, burning shrines. Each battle bled the Imperium, but each victory bled Abaddon as well. The talon grew heavier, hungrier, its claws twitching even at rest. He felt it feeding not only on his enemies but on himself, draining fragments of what he once had been. He wondered if it was not only a weapon, but a wound that could never heal. One night, as the fleet drifted between storms, Varus entered Abaddon's chamber again. His face was lined with fatigue, his voice hushed but urgent. Ezekiel, the warbands grow restless. They want more than raids. They want thrones, spoils, dominion. They look to you to give them more than fire. If you do not, they will find someone who will. Abaddon turned, his eyes shadowed, his voice cold. Let them look. Let them whisper. I will crush them as I crushed the others. But Varus did not relent. You cannot kill every rival, not forever. The more you kill, the more they will rise. The gods will see to it. If you mean to endure, you must give them something greater than fear. For a moment, silence stretched. Abaddon's gaze softened, just enough for old memory to flicker through. I gave Horus everything. I believed in him as a son believes in a father, and I watched him fall. I will not make idols again. I will not give them faith. Fear is enough. Varus bowed his head, but his silence carried sorrow more than obedience. He left without another word, and Abaddon stood alone, the talon glowing faintly in the dark. He wondered if perhaps Varus was right, if perhaps fear could not last forever. But the thought only deepened his resolve. If fear was all he could wield, then he would wield it without end. The next campaign began without warning. Abaddon ordered the fleets to strike not at Cadia, not at Terra, but at the lesser fortresses scattered across Segmentum Obscurus. World after world burned, their populations enslaved or slaughtered, their faith ground into ash. Abaddon fought at the front, the talon carving paths through defenders, who screamed the Emperor's name as though it could shield them. He heard their screams as fuel, not plea. Each victory bound the warbands tighter, silencing whispers with the sound of blood. But with each victory came sacrifice. Supplies dwindled, ships were lost. Rivals bled in his name, but kept their blades sharp for the day they might turn them. Even his closest captains began to wonder if endless war was enough, if their strength was being spent for nothing but shadows. Abaddon heard their doubts in the silence of the halls, in the way eyes lingered too long on him, in the way conversations died when he entered. He had silenced them with blood before. He would silence them again if he must. When at last the fleets returned to the eye, laden with spoils and echoes of terror, Abaddon stood on the bridge, staring into the storm. His warriors roared his name, their chants rising like thunder. They called him War Master. They called him Despoiler. They called him Inevitable. But Abaddon heard none of it. He heard only the laughter that lingered, patient and eternal, as though every war he fought, every victory he claimed, every rival he slew, only proved what he sought to deny. He whispered into the storm, his voice steady but quiet. I am not yours. I am war, and war belongs to no one. The talon pulsed faintly in answer, its claws flexing like a living thing. And though the laughter rose louder, curling through the warp, Abaddon did not bow. He stood unbroken, yet chained by every battle, every oath, every choice that brought him closer to the eternity he despised. And still he knew he would never stop. For to stop was to admit defeat, and defeat was the one chain he would never wear. The eye of terror writhed with storms, as if mocking the fleets that drifted within its grasp. Great arcs of lightning illuminated the shattered hulls of ancient ships, wrecks that had floated for millennia, remnants of rebellions long forgotten. The vengeful spirit moved among them like a predator among corpses, its shadow vast, its engines burning with fury drawn from the warp itself. Inside, the halls throbbed with the noise of warriors drinking, chanting, sharpening their blades for wars that would never end. Yet beneath their exultation lay unease, a tension that ran like a fracture through the Black Legion. They had followed Abaddon into endless war, but each war cut deeper into their strength. Each raid demanded more of their blood, and whispers had begun again. In his chamber, Abaddon sat alone, the talon resting on the table before him, its claws glowing faintly as if alive. He stared at it for a long time, hearing the echoes of Horus in its iron, feeling the weight of chains disguised as power. The gods whispered still, more insistent than ever, their voices dripping promises of dominion. They showed him visions of the galaxy aflame, his face carved into the minds of mortals as an eternal conqueror. Yet he saw also the price, his soul hollowed, his will consumed until nothing remained of Ezekiel Abaddon but a vessel for their hunger. He clenched the gauntlet until sparks flared, his voice a whisper meant only for himself. I will not be you, not Horus, not theirs. I am war, and war bends to no master. The door hissed open, and Varus entered, his expression grave. He bowed his head, but did not kneel. The warlords grow restless again, he said quietly. They question why we bleed for raids and plunder, but never claim thrones. They see your refusal to strike Cadia as weakness. They whisper that perhaps the gods have withdrawn their favor. Abaddon rose slowly, his presence filling the chamber like a storm. Let them whisper, he said. Whispers are silenced with blood. Varus met his gaze with the courage of one who had stood beside him since the lunar wolves. You cannot kill shadows forever, Ezekiel. Every rival you cut down gives rise to another. They follow you now because they fear you, but fear alone may not hold them forever. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then Abaddon turned back to the talon, his voice cold as iron. Fear is eternal, Varus. I will prove it again if I must. The summons went out, and the warlords gathered in the great hall. They came draped in scars and arrogance, their armor etched with the marks of their own allegiances to gods or none at all. The air stank of oil, blood, and tension. Some bowed as Abaddon entered, others only stared, daring him with their silence. The word-bearer raised his voice, a hymn laced with venom. We fight and fight, yet where is our dominion? Where is the empire we were promised? Horus sought terror. You refuse even Cadia. Perhaps the despoiler fears what he cannot conquer. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. A world-eater slammed his fist against the table, laughing. Perhaps it is so. Perhaps Abaddon is no war master, but only another scavenger wearing a dead man's gauntlet. Abaddon stood, unmoving, letting the words coil around the hall, like the call came not from the gods, nor from the warp, but from the Imperium itself. A transmission, broken and battered, stumbled its way into the edges of the eye. A desperate plea from a dying world, a fortress moon on the edge of the segmentum solar, begging for aid as demonic incursions tore through its outer bastions. The coordinates flickered with static, the vox distorted by interference, but the fear was unmistakable. No Imperial fleet responded. None would. The border worlds were left to die. Abaddon received it in silence, the message echoing through the vengeful spirit's bridge like a fading heartbeat. It was not mercy that made him listen. It was opportunity. He stood before the map again, the stars arrayed like bones in a crypt. Around him, the warlords murmured, their voices flickering with expectation. They had tasted war, but hunger returned quickly. Whispers of stagnation had begun to coil through the lower decks, warbands falling into blood feuds, champions dueling in darkened seas, halls. The momentum of the crusade was fracturing. Abaddon knew it could not be allowed to rot. A new fire was needed, something bold enough to remind them why they feared him. The fortress moon's name meant nothing. It was a dead stone by any measure, holding little strategic value. But it stood as a beacon along a rarely used corridor through the warp, an ancient and unstable passage once charted during the Great Crusade. If stabilized, it could become a knife pointed directly toward Cadia's throat. And Cadia, though not yet Abaddon's target, remained his inevitable wound. He gave the order. The fleets would descend, not to raise, but to claim. This was not another fire to stoke fear. This would be a symbol, proof that the Black Legion could not only destroy, but hold, that they could carve out a blade of real space, dripping with warp, and keep it steady against the storm. The warlords stirred at the command, many uncertain, others intrigued, but none disobeyed. Abaddon's presence was still too heavy, his silence too sharp. They arrived like a storm swallowed by another storm. The warp opened its jaws, and the vengeful spirit emerged first, dragging reality behind it in shrieking coils. The fortress moon loomed ahead, battered and ancient, its outer plates torn by fire, its inner sanctum still resisting, loyalists clinging to shrines with cracked faith. The demons had breached the lower levels, their screeches echoing through fractured vox lines. What the Imperium had failed to answer, Abaddon would seize. He descended personally, not for spectacle, but for certainty. His presence would not be delegated. The talon hung from his gauntlet like a second spine, its claws restless, its hunger thrumming against his bones. Warriors followed in his shadow, Black Legionnaires, word-bearer zealots, iron warriors, whose siegecraft split walls like bone. They swept through the halls like a tide of nightmares, their pace unrelenting, their focus absolute. Within hours, the demons were driven out or consumed, their forms scattering into motes of shrieking unreality. The loyalists fared little better. Some prayed to the corpse on terror as they died. Others begged for mercy, their faith splintered by the silence that had answered their pleas. Abaddon offered them none. He watched their temples burn, their relics turn to ash, and he made no proclamations. He simply walked forward, as if destiny itself opened before him like a gate. In the core of the fortress, beneath layers of rusted armor and screaming conduits, they found the vault. A sealed chamber lined with pylons etched in ancient sigils, blackstone, the kind the Cadians had once guarded, the kind that thrummed faintly against the warp like a heartbeat against cold stone. Its presence repelled the demonic, bent the tide of the eye back from the breach. It had been placed long ago by hands long forgotten, meant to hold reality steady in places where it frayed. Here was the truth behind the plea. This world mattered not because of its cannons or fleets, but because it was an anchor. Abaddon stood before the vault, the claws of the talon twitching against its edge. His warriors kept their distance, sensing the tension in the air. The gods whispered to him in that moment, not with promises, but with hunger. The Blackstone was a threat to them, a silencing, and yet, to Abaddon, it was opportunity. With this fragment of stability, he could shape the warp's edge to his will, carve a stable path from eye to bastion. He ordered the pylons preserved. Engineers of the Dark Mechanicum were summoned, their rites twisted and vile but effective. They began the work of tuning the vault, shaping it into a bridgehead. And as the fortress reshaped beneath his will, Abaddon stood watch, silent, unmoving, his eyes fixed on the stars beyond. Varus approached, his tone cautious. The warbands murmur again. They call this a risk, a waste. They say you hold when we should burn. Abaddon didn't look at him. Let them murmur. They mistake fire for strength. War is not fire. War is the shape of fire wielded with intent. This place is a blade. They will see that soon enough. But the gods will wait, Abaddon cut in, his voice final. They may hunger, but even they know patience. I give them blood, I give them war, but I do not give them everything. Not yet. Varus nodded and withdrew, but doubt clung to him like shadow. Abaddon watched him go and felt the weight deepen. He had built this war on defiance, but each step forward drew more threads from the gods into his path. They praised him still, but he felt it, how their praise was another leash. When the work was done and the warp corridor stabilized, Abaddon stood once more on the bridge of the vengeful spirit. The fortress behind him was no longer a ruin, but a spear, a fixed wound in the Imperium's flank. A corridor had opened, narrow, unstable, but real. A path through the eye toward Cadia, toward Terra, toward the end. His warlords assembled again. This time they did not question. They saw what he had made. They saw the hunger in his eyes. And though many feared the gods, and many more feared each other, all feared him more. That fear was his to wield. The talon glimmered faintly at his side. Its claws clicked softly, tasting the tension in the air. Abaddon looked into the stars, and in them he saw not thrones or empires, but the slow, inevitable collapse of all things. He said nothing, but war stirred in the silence. Not a raid, not a crusade, something deeper, something final. The next blow would not be for fear. It would be for the foundations themselves. And somewhere, in the warp, the gods smiled, because even defiance feeds the fire. And they could wait. They had always waited. The corridor was open, narrow, unstable, pulsing with the breath of the warp, but real. It stretched like a scar through reality, connecting the broken edge of the eye of Terra to the outer reach of the segmentum solar. At its far end, looming like a fist clenched around a wound, stood Cadia. The fortress world, the gate, the threshold between the madness of the eye and the fragile hope of mankind. For 10,000 years it had held. Now, through the wound Abaddon had carved, it could be reached. The warlords felt it in their bones. Their blades whispered it in dreams. And though none dared say it aloud, they all knew what was coming. Still, Abaddon did not speak of Cadia. Not yet. He watched the stars from the command dais, the talon resting across his knee like a beast that slept with one eye open. He heard the murmurs across the fleets. Too many warbands had begun to sharpen their blades inward. Word-bearers whispered of betrayal. Iron warriors argued over fortification rights on the newly claimed Fortress Moon, and Night Lords vanished into the dark between ships. Discipline was a thread pulled tight across blades, and he knew that even one slip could snap it. Varus entered the chamber as he always did, silent, waiting for acknowledgement. He stood in the blue wash of the star chart, his expression grim. "There was a killing," he said simply. 3 ships. World Eaters this time. They turned on their word-bearer allies during the rite, blamed them for holding back warp offerings. It spread through the decks like wildfire. Abaddon didn't move. His gaze was fixed on the path through the warp, a thin thread of red etched through the map like a vein in stone. How many dead? Thousands. Decks burned open. Vox channels are corrupted. They were feeding it to the gods by the end. No loyalty, just hunger. A pause. Then Abaddon stood. "Then they have forgotten what we are." He descended to the decks without guard. No procession, no ceremony. Just him and the Talon, its claws twitching as if hungry for correction. The warships that housed the rebellion were still smouldering, their hulls split like carcasses, their corridors slick with blood. He walked through the carnage with deliberate steps. The air stank of ozone and rot, demonic residue clinging to the walls like frost. Survivors knelt at his approach, some in shame, others in expectation of mercy that would never come. In the central chamber, the remnants of both warbands had been chained together, shoulder to shoulder, stripped of rank, their faces burned, their tongues cut. Warriors reduced to trembling relics of their own rebellion. Abaddon stood before them, saying nothing. Silence was the first blade. And when it had cut deep enough, he raised the talon. He killed them slowly. Not as punishment, but as message. Each body torn apart was a syllable in the language of obedience. When it was done, and the blood pooled knee-deep, he turned to the watching ranks and spoke one sentence. "You are not gods." He returned to the vengeful spirit alone, the deck slick with blood. Not one soul dared follow him. In the days that followed, the warbands grew quiet. The silence did not come from unity, but from the absence of challenge. Abaddon had reminded them that the only divinity in the fleet was his will, and that it would not be tested. But within that silence, the gods began to press harder. He felt it in his sleep, if it could still be called sleep. Dreams turned to visions, visions to commands. The talon whispered when he held it. It craved something now, something vast. Abaddon could feel it every time he gripped the hilt, its thirst no longer just for flesh, but for meaning. He began to see the faces of the slain in his mind. Kaled, the rival champion, the sorcerer with glowing eyes, even Horus. They rose in silence, not to accuse, but to observe. One night, the air itself grew heavy, and Abaddon woke to the scent of fire. He rose from the obsidian slab he called a bed, and followed the scent through the darkened corridors of the vengeful spirit. The lights flickered, the ship itself groaned like a dying god. In the chamber beyond the strategium, he found a shape waiting. Cloaked in shadow, its outline shifted with every heartbeat. It did not speak. It did not need to. The gods did not always speak in words. Abaddon stepped forward, the talon at his side. "You want me to strike," he said, voice calm. "You want Cadia?" The shadow shivered. A dozen eyes opened and closed across its shifting skin. Faces formed and vanished. Some were his, some were not. He continued, "You think Cadia is the gate, that if it falls, the Imperium will follow. But I know better. I know it will bleed, not break. That it will fight in death, as it did in life." The thing did not move. The warp trembled around it. A faint ringing, like the cracking of ice. Abaddon took one more step forward. "You believe I am yours, that each war makes me your instrument, that my refusal is another form of worship. But I am not Horus. I do not seek thrones. I do not need crowns. I only need war, and war belongs to no one." The shadow faded. No threat, no demand, only acceptance, or perhaps patience. The gods had always known how to wait. When Abaddon returned to the bridge, the officers rose in silence. The star map flickered before him, the corridor to Cadia pulsing with a dim, red heartbeat. He stared at it for a long time. The weight of what would come next hung heavy in the air. Varys stood at his side, watching. "You've made your decision," he said. It was not a question. Abaddon nodded once. The gate must break. The command went out in silence. No speeches, no glory, just war. The fleets turned, one by one, aligning along the corridor. 1,000 ships bristling with ancient weapons and new heresies. The eye opened wider. The stars beyond Cadia dimmed. And as the vengeful spirit led them forward, Abaddon stood unmoving, the talon pulsing at his side. He felt the storm ahead. He felt the weight of expectation. He felt the truth burning in his chest. He was not marching to victory. He was marching to break the spine of belief. Not for power, not for vengeance, for silence, for the end of oaths, for the death of faith itself. And Cadia, the gate, would be the first to fall. The sky above Cadia burned. It began as a slow pulse in the void, faint tremors along the warp corridors, flickers of energy too vast for astropaths to comprehend. Then came the ships, silent at first, their shadows stretching like knives across the stars. The Black Legion arrived not in force, but in inevitability. There was no warning. There was no ultimatum. The vengeful spirit emerged like a scar opening in space, its prow ablaze, and behind it surged warbands without number, each hungrier than the last. On Cadia, alarms rang, like the howls of dying gods. High command scrambled, mobilizing regiments, cycling orbital platforms, reciting prayers that sounded more like confessions. They had long spoken of the Despoiler in whispers, wrapped him in prophecy and denial. Now he came not as myth, but as judgment. Abaddon stood on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, surrounded by silence. He gave no orders. The course was already set, the blade already drawn. He watched the fortress world grow larger in the void, each orbital defense tower snapping into view. The light from Cadia's twin suns cast faint gold across the battle plate of his armor, but it did not warm him. The talon pulsed against his gauntlet, eager. Beneath his breath, he whispered only once. "This is not conquest. This is memory erased." The first strike came in silence. A lance of dark energy, hurled from a warpsmith's altar, pierced Cadia's orbital ring and shattered it in a single stroke. The broken pieces tumbled through void space, dragging fire in their wake, igniting with impact against the atmosphere. Defense platforms returned fire, but they were already behind the curve. Demon engines screamed through the upper layers of the sky, trailing madness and ash. Abaddon did not flinch as the vengeful spirit took fire. Shields flared, metal rang like bell peals across the hull, but his eyes stayed on the surface. A single point of focus, Castor Kraph, the heart, the symbol, the lie of permanence. He ordered the descent. The landings came like the breaking of a curse. Dropships fell like meteors, engines flaring with warp fire, their hulls splitting open to disgorge legions. Black-armored giants marched in formation, chanting not names, but intentions. They fired not to kill, but to unmake. Each kill was a fracture in faith. Each building leveled was a scripture erased. The sky cracked with lightning. The ground bled. Abaddon walked through it all. He stepped from the dropship alone, his presence a silence that consumed the roar of battle. Where he passed, warriors fell in behind him, not out of loyalty, but because even the warp bent around his path. His stride was steady, unhurried, as if time itself made room for him. His target was the pylon field, buried deep in the earth, guarded by legions who did not know they were already lost. The pylons had stood for 10,000 years, humming with ancient power, holding the eye at bay. They were not weapons. They were anchors. They held reality to shape. They held the gods at a distance. They had never fallen. Abaddon would make them kneel. He led the charge personally, the talon carving through trenches, its claws slicing through armor and hope alike. Lasfire hissed across his pauldrons. Shells exploded against his chestplate. He did not slow. Around him, the battle spiraled outward into chaos. Artillery roared. Titans screamed. Warp beasts tore through steel. And still, he walked. The entrance to the control vault was buried beneath a mountain of dead. Abaddon stepped over them without pause, his armor soaked, his mind clear. The defenders were fewer now, their lines stretched, their hope thinning. He met them without contempt. They were not his enemies. They were the last breath of a dying world. He breached the vault alone. The walls were lined with blackstone, humming with impossible frequencies. The pylons still pulsed overhead, tethered to machines older than memory. An adept raised a pistol, trembling. Abaddon struck him down with a flick of the talon, not in rage, not in sport, in silence. He approached the core, placing his hand against its surface. The talon screamed, the warp recoiled, the gods howled. He did not smile. He did not weep. He tore the conduit open. Outside, the sky broke. The pylons collapsed inward, not with explosion, but with vacuum. Reality bent at the knees. The corridor that had once held the eye at bay fractured. The storm surged through, unbound. Cadia groaned beneath it. The crust split. Cities fell into silence. Varus saw it first from orbit. The crack across the world, from pole to pole. A wound that pulsed like a heartbeat. He whispered, "It's done," and then wept, though he did not know why. The last message from Cadia was not a scream. It was a silence, as if the world, so proud, so unyielding, had simply let go. Abaddon stood beneath the falling sky, alone in the ruin. Warp light bathed him. Fire washed over the plains. The talon vibrated like a living thing, but he felt no triumph, no vindication, only stillness. He turned his gaze skyward. The warp storm now stretched uninterrupted, a path laid bare. The gate was broken. The future was open. Behind him, the warbands howled in ecstasy. Some knelt. Some praised the gods. Others carved their names into stone. But Abaddon said nothing. He walked through the ruin of Cadia as a man unchanged, not blessed, not ascended, not crowned, only a figure in black moving through dust that would never settle. When he returned to the vengeful spirit, he found his chamber quiet. He placed the talon on the altar of iron and sat before it in the dark. He listened, as he always did, for the laughter. But there was none, only the sound of silence. And in that silence, he understood what he had done. He had not claimed victory. He had not become legend. He had simply removed the last weight that held back the storm, and now the galaxy would drown.